Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm your host, Jay Daniels. This week, I had the honor of speaking with pianist and vocalist Betty Bryant. She recently turned 90 years old, but she still keeps very busy with studio recordings and live performances in the Los Angeles area. Her most recent album is a collection of standards called Project 88. Join us now as Betty and I talk about her career and also her beginnings as a musician on the Kansas City jazz scene.
Sort of by a fluke, I began in Topeka.
Yeah.
Which I went to college in Topeka, and after I graduated, I stayed there a couple of years. Up until that point, I had only had classical music. I didn't know anything about jazz or pop or anything like that, except what I heard on the radio. And one night, I was listening to some station out of Oklahoma. I have no idea what it was. And there was a DJ that was playing records and interspersing them with live music. So I had a friend who was a DJ, and I told him about this because I just thought it was interesting. And he told his station manager, and the station manager asked if I could play the piano, and I said, yeah, a little. So at that time, I knew how to play St. Louis Blues, and I knew how to play Body and Soul up to the bridge.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still don't play the bridge to Body and Soul right.
You just let the rest of the ensemble handle that part, right?
Right, yeah. I block it. I don't know. I really have a mental block against the bridge to Body and Soul for some reason.
Yeah.
But anyway, the guy liked me, and at that time, there was a show on called Lonesome Gal in the middle of the night, and he thought that I had a sexy voice, and I had never sung at all. So he said, well, try it. Just sing something. So I sang St. Louis Blues. That's what I could sing. And believe it or not, they just put me on the air. They didn't hire me. I didn't make any money at it. But they put me on opposite Lonesome Gal because she had a real smoky voice, and they thought that I did too. And they put me on after the ball game. So I never knew when I was going, what time I was going to be on or anything. The whole thing was really sort of strange. Mm. But I did it, and it was my entrance into the pop. And at that time, I was really into listening to bebop, because this was about the time that Dizzy Gillespie was big, around 1950.
And we should clarify, just as a scope here, you just turned 90 years old. So, you were a young woman during this time, coming up when a lot of the roots of jazz were really starting to take shape as far as bebop moving into hard bop. I mean, you're one of the few people today who can speak to a lot of the infancy of this jazz sound.
It's true. I don't ever think of myself that way, but it is true, I guess. And there was this whole big thing about West Coast and East Coast, one versus the other. As far as the West Coast sound was cool sound, the East Coast sound was more hard driven. And so everybody in the Middle West was more East Coast. So this is like, maybe pre-Jazz Messengers, but definitely the beginning of Dizzy Gillespie and, of course, Charlie Parker. And that's where my head was, but that's not what I was doing.
Yeah.
I wasn't strong enough to be doing that.
Did you have any ambitions at this point as far as making this a career, or was this more or less a side hobby for you at this point? I mean, you're just out of college, if I remember right.
It was a hobby, if you want to call it a hobby. It was just something to do. I didn't really believe that my path lay in that direction at all, in this direction at all, at that point. It was just something to do. It was not something to make money doing or to make a living at. And I was a psychiatric secretary. In those days, Menninger's was the biggest psychiatric foundation in the United States, the Menninger Foundation, and I was a secretary there. And I really loved that job. It was a good job. And I loved being a secretary, and I loved the whole psychiatric thing. So that's sort of where I was at that point in loving it.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that as far as the piano that you had been taught, the piano that you had learned, it was mainly of a classical variety. So am I to understand that as far as a jazz background necessarily, there weren't any real jazz musicians in your family? Is that right?
No, none at all. There weren't any musicians in my family, period. They didn't, on either side.
Yeah.
But my grandfather had given my grandmother a grand piano for their first anniversary, which was also my mother's birthday. And my grandmother gave it to me when I was 4. So that was how I got to learning piano so early. My father was a school teacher at that time. He went on to get into school administration, but at that time he was a teacher.
Yeah.
And not making very much money. So there was another school teaching couple that came to live with us for a while. Just sort of like, a rooming house would be. And I had this piano. And so Des just started teaching me. Her name was Desdemona Davis. And she just started teaching me because I had a talent for it. It was just easy for me. And so she just started teaching me like free. I think by the time she quit teaching me, I was paying or my parents were paying like a quarter for a lesson.
I'd say that's a good discount that you got there, Betty.
Yeah, it went on for a while. Until I was 16, I took lessons from her.
Let's talk classical for just a moment, because a lot of folks probably don't know this about your musical background. Can you remember any of the favorite classical or romantic era composers that you learned from in those days?
I did like ritual fire dance. I like the fiery things. Schumann. I loved Bach always. 2-part inventions. In the early days, I just learned, and she had the teacher had a recital every year, and all of her students played on the recital like two songs or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But then when I was 16, I had my own recital, and I did a whole recital. But right this minute, I cannot remember anything that was on it.
Well, you probably haven't been asked about that recital in a while, I suppose.
Oh, no, I haven't.
You mentioned that you were playing on radio locally. You had a slot where they would have you play and sing. And we know that since you started in radio, that you were able to do more than St. Louis Blues and the first half of Body and Soul. Let's think about some of those early musical influences that you had, because you mentioned that you would hear the sounds of jazz over the radio. You mentioned Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie. Were there any other women performers that stood out for you in those days?
Mary Lou Williams was very popular. She's from Kansas City, and she was a big piano, not an influence for me, but somebody really big to know about, like not Pearl Bailey, but Hazel Scott.
Yeah.
And there was somebody, Dorothy Donegan.
Yes.
And Dorothy Donegan and Hazel Scott were almost like rivals, and they were like piano gymnasts practically. They just could do anything. They would play backwards and 2 pianos at a time and all kinds of weird stuff, and they were people to be admired but not to be emulated as far as I was concerned.
Yeah. I was going to ask, did you ever try to play 2 pianos at once like Hazel Scott did at one time?
No.
Yeah,
I see no reason to do that.
Yeah, I prefer to let the music just speak for itself. If I tried to do that, I'd probably make a fool of myself on stage,
I know I would. and you couldn't play any more notes with two pianos than you can play with. I mean, you've got two hands, and so they work just as well on one piano as they would do on two.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. And some days I can't even get it to work right on the one piano for me, you know? We're speaking with pianist and vocalist Betty Bryant, our in-studio guest here from Simply Timeless. And, you spent time in Topeka, spent time around Kansas City. How long were you in the Kansas City area before you started to head west?
I don't remember when I left Topeka to go back to Kansas City. For some reason, that whole thing just escapes me. But for some reason, I went back to Kansas City. And there was a guy named Earl Grant. And Earl was great, and everybody loved Earl. And he was moving to California, so he was playing at a place called Millie's. So Millie, I think more as a novelty, because like to have a school teacher's daughter playing in her club was something. And Earl was leaving, so she hired me to follow Earl in there. By this time, I knew how to play more songs. But I wasn't really jazz. I was just doing like a single, so you just play requests.
Yeah.
So I love jazz, but I wasn't doing it. And somehow or another, I met Jay McShann, and that had been my idol since I was a little girl. I think maybe when I was around 10 or 12 or something, I got one of those books, how to play like so-and-so. And there was a Jay McShann book, and I learned how to play blues.
Mm.
And I learned his runs. In those days, there was no TV, of course. And almost everybody I knew had a piano. Old uprights and stuff, but people just had pianos in the parlor. And my best friend in high school, her father played sort of rickety-tick piano. And we would sit and try to play boogie-woogie. So we learned how to play boogie-woogie. But everybody learned how to play boogie-woogie. It's just 1, 4, or 5 chords, And everybody knew how to do that. It wasn't even considered piano playing. Just everybody did it. It's like heart and soul. Earl moved to California, and I took Earl's place in Kansas City. And I stayed there for a while, and then there was an agent in Kansas City that got interested in me. I was cute in those days, and I think that had more to do with it than my ability to be truthful. Let's see, I worked at Millie's. I worked at the Jockey Club for some reason for a small time on 12th Street. I think those are the only 2 black clubs that I worked at in Kansas City. But they got me into the white clubs. That was practically unheard of. Everything was still segregated at that point.
Right.
So I was working at the Uptown Interlude, and it was way out, like 36 and, I'm acting like you know where I'm talking about. 36 and Broadway or someplace. It was really far out, but I had to pass by Johnny's, which is where Jay McShann was playing, and somehow or another I had met Jay. I adored Jay McShann's music. And, of course, Charlie Parker started out with Jay McShann, so he had a big reputation. And Al Hibbler, I didn't know Charlie Parker and Al Hibbler, but they had both started out with Jay McShann, so Jay was pretty big because of the people that he had helped along the way, as well as on his own. But I loved Jay McShann's music, so I started stopping by Jay McShann's on the way home from the Uptown Interlude. He would let me sit in, and it was so much fun. I got to play with his band, and the people allowed me to do it. I mean, they couldn't even sit in the audience on the breaks or anything. That's how segregated everything was at that time. But I got to sit in with him. Then little by little, I did a few other clubs, and when I came out here, I'd been working at a place called the Pink Elephant downtown. And again, Earl was working at Ye Little Club in Beverly Hills, and his night off was Monday. So he said, "Well, why don't you do my night off?" And that was my introduction into L.A. So Earl Grant played a big part in my leaving Kansas City and in my introduction to Los Angeles.
And I take it in all of this that even though you say that you love the job being a psychiatric secretary, I mean, at some point you had to make a decision to give that up and go with your music.
Oh, that had gone a long time. When I moved back to Kansas City, I had decided that music was where it was.
Yeah.
That was for me. Now I can't imagine my life any other kind of way, and it has kept me young and it's kept me happy, and I've been able to do it all of my life. It's just I don't have enough good things to say about music and me.
In your opinion, even with all of the changes in music over the years that you have seen, what do you think enables you to continue to have that fresh and young sound that you do?
I love to improvise, and for me, that's what jazz is all about. I cannot learn a piece and learn a solo and expect it to do that every time I play the piece. It's just never going to be the same way every time.
Yeah.
There might be parts of it that are, but most of it won't be. But the whole thing is about improvisation for me. And I say for me, with respect to all of those people that write arrangements and, play them the same way all the time. There are a lot of people that do that very well. But for me, and what keeps it fresh for me, is to be able to improvise.
Now, let me ask you this, because we brought up the age a couple of times during this interview. And you say, looking back, you don't know anything else or any other way that your life could have gone without music. Do you think that performing, improvising, really challenging your creative skill, do you think that that's helped to contribute to a good, fulfilling, long life?
Yes. Very simply. Yeah, I can't imagine me being any other way. And fortunately, I've been surrounded by people that have been nurturing as far as that's concerned. Nobody's told me, no, you can't do that. I'm really, really, really family oriented. And my kids, my grandkids, they're always there, no matter where I'm playing, they show up. They're always happy for me. Nobody's jealous of me. Nobody is jealous for themselves or think that they don't get enough attention. It's just we all sort of support each other. But they are, like my rooting team. I have a very good life. I just do.
Do any of your children or grandchildren, did they pick up a musical knack, or are they just listeners?
They're just listeners. I have one son and his family, and I say my children. When I say my children, I'm talking about all of them. They have twins who are 9 years old, and since they were little, even they haven't ever complained about having to go to listen to Grandma.
And they better not complain, because otherwise Grandma might not have them over for Sunday supper. At least that's how it is. At least that's how it was for me growing up. It's like, yeah, you took good care of Grandma because she took good care of you. So let me ask you this. Your most recent album that came out, Project 88, which was kind of a play on words, 88 keys on the piano, but it was also right around the time that you were celebrating your 88th. And now, 2 years later, here we are, you're celebrating your 90th birthday. There is still so much life and so much energy within your music. I think, Oh Lady Be Good from the album, They Say It's Wonderful. I mean, these these are not easy listening arrangements. These are filled with energy. Do you see yourself playing for as long as you possibly can in the future? I mean, let's be honest. Some people, when they get to be a certain age, are like, I want to slow down. I mean, do you ever see yourself slowing down, Betty?
No. It's all or nothing. The voice is not what it always was, but it's like I've always loved lyrics, and so I'm able to tell stories. And so if I don't hit, high notes and all of that stuff, and I don't even like a lot of the singers that are out today that are screaming, but I can always tell a story, and that's what a lot of my lyrics are about, and I write a lot too, and same thing. When I write songs that have a story to tell.
Pianist and vocalist Betty Bryant, our in-studio guest this week from Simply Timeless. Take a moment to visit her website, bettybryant.com. Special thanks to Betty and our mutual friend, Mark Christian Miller, for their help in making this interview possible. Until we meet again, I'm Jay Daniels, thanking you for joining us in studio.